All right, thank you, Matt, for the introduction. Thank you to Riviera for hosting this seminar. What a blessing to be with all of you this afternoon. I was joking with somebody at lunch. I said the 1 o'clock slot is the slot they put the person when they know everyone's going to sleep. So, and then that couple left. So I don't know. I scared them away, I guess. Okay, so I'll try to keep you awake. But Matt's got the notes for my presentation. So a little bit about me. Matt said some things about me. My wife and I are celebrating our 25th wedding anniversary in October. Yes, praise the Lord. I invited my wife to come, and you would have saw just a wonderful saint if she came, being married to me for 25 years, but she couldn't come today. We have 4 kids, 3 adult kids, and 1 17-year-old. Our oldest, Sophia, lives in Seattle. She's a nurse at Children's Hospital in Seattle. And we have a daughter, Anna, who's graduating from Oregon State in June, and she's going to be an accountant. And then we have a son at Corbin, who's a freshman, and then our daughter, Olivia, she's a junior this year. So very proud of my kids. It's been said years ago that if your kids turn out to be good people, don't take too much credit for it. If they turn out to be bad people, don't take too much of the blame also. So I think there's probably a little bit of truth to that statement in terms of like God's grace that we need in our life. But I'm so thankful for my wife, for my kids, and a chance to be here. So I want to affirm you guys for being here on a Saturday afternoon at 1 o'clock. Being a part of a parenting seminar. So the very first thing I want to say is parenting is hard. It is hard. Being a father of 3 adult kids, and another one's going to be adult next year, parenting's hard. We need a lot of grace. We need a lot of truth. So I want to affirm you for choosing to be here on this Saturday, and for those of you that were here last night to learn more about parenting. On that note, I am going to open up in prayer. God, thank you for this opportunity to be here. Thank you for each person that's been a part of this parenting workshop. Lord, we ask that you be a part of this time. We ask that you would help each of us to learn the things that we need to learn so that we could be better parents for your glory. And we pray this in your Son's name. All right. So, anyone here who would say you have a green thumb? You're really good with plants or gardens, or no one here is. Okay, well, I guess we're done. Let's leave. Rachel. Yes. Yeah. So you like plants? House plants, nurturing them, helping them grow. What are some really important aspects to helping a plant grow? Anybody can answer that. What are some important aspects to that? Dynamics. Light. You need light. Yeah. Did I hear water? Water. Yeah. Anything else? Good soil. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, you need water, you need light, you need soil. I'm going to focus on water and light as being 2 essentials for plants to grow. And I like to use the nurturing of plants as an analogy for nurturing kids. I think it's a really good analogy because there are things that we can do to help a plant grow, and then there are things we need God to do to help a plant grow. And it's the same with raising kids. There's things that we can do, and there's things that God has to do. So we get to partner with God in that work of raising these kids that he's entrusted to us. The two main things that I believe that parents need to provide for their kids is grace and truth. Those are the two main things. Where do we get that from? We get that from John 1:14, and in John is describing Jesus, the Messiah. And he says this, "We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." So Jesus, who came from the Father, was full of grace and truth. Now, we're not Jesus. We're not God. We're finite. He's infinite. But we can reflect him. We can have grace and truth in our life. And when it comes to nurturing our kids, we need to have bountiful grace and bountiful truth. And that's really the main point of what I'm going to talk about, is that parenting that nurtures children's growth requires grace and truth. But parenting that lacks grace and truth provokes children to anger. Leslie referred to Ephesians 6:4 earlier and talked about this. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this verse, but I am going to go over it again because I think repetition is always good when it comes to learning and comprehending. I'm also, other than being a therapist, I'm also a professor, adjunct professor at Bushnell University. I teach in the counseling department there and the psychology department. So that's the other thing that I do. And I'm also an ordained minister, if you didn't know that. Matt, I think he did mention that. So Ephesians 6:4 says, "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord." Now, Paul is directing that to fathers, and I think that detail should not be missed, that he's directing that admonishment to fathers. But I do think that that admonishment applies to all parents, fathers and mothers. Fathers and mothers can provoke their children to anger. Don't provoke your children is a command from God. What does it mean to provoke? It means to stimulate or incite someone to do or feel something. Okay, so there's a stimulation or inciting someone to do that. In this case, it's a parent inciting their children to anger, provoking their children to anger. And what we're going to talk about is that provocation happens through relational patterns. I think this is what Paul is referring to. And to be more specific, it has to do with the attitudes and behaviors of the parent, with each other and with the children. Okay? So I'm a professor. At any time, if you have a question, feel free to raise your hand. Okay? I'm used to people interrupting me when I talk, so this isn't a sermon. If you have any questions, feel free to raise your hands. Oops. Okay, so anger can lead to an explosion. I work with a lot of men who struggle with anger. I've taught anger management classes. And so anger really becomes a problem when it starts getting up to that 9 or 10 there. I like to use that meter illustration to think about how our anger can go from a 0 to a 10. Paul says, "In your anger, do not sin." Okay, so what that says to me is that having feelings of anger are not necessarily sinful. There are times to be angry. When we hear stories on the news of children being abused or malnourishment, we should get angry about that, right? What are some other things that it's appropriate to be angry about? Disobedience. It is appropriate. Yes. Right. When you give your children clear directions and they rebel against that and you get angry, that is appropriate, right? What does the Bible call that? It calls it righteous indignation. Okay, but when does anger become a problem? When does it cross a line? It crosses that line when it hits that 10 mark and leads to an explosion. And when an explosion happens, usually either property is going to be damaged, people's feelings are going to be hurt, right? There's going to be physical or emotional damage when that anger hits that 10. Now, how does that become a problem in terms of our relating to our kids? The problem is that when our kids repeatedly hit that 10 over and over again, what happens is they start developing resentment inside. They start developing bitterness. Okay? And so that's going back to Ephesians, where Paul is inciting us, or he's admonishing us, not inciting, he's admonishing us to not provoke our children to anger. I believe he's referring to that potential that we have to create bitterness and resentment in our kids. I'll come back to that. So, as Leslie was saying earlier, children need discipline and instruction. Paul goes on to say to bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And the biblical definition of discipline is to guide or train in righteousness. I love that little picture of that terrier mix. It reminds me of my dog, Lucy. We got Lucy from the animal dog rescue shelter, I think it's called. And Lucy is quite a dog. Lucy has anxiety issues. Anybody have a dog with anxiety issues? Serious. Has anyone had to put their dog on medication because of anxiety issues? We have. I mean, she is quite a dog. It's crazy. I mean, we don't know what triggers her. I mean, it could be anything. Her stomach growling, could be a sound she hears, and before you know it, she's climbing up into the bookshelf, trying to hide herself, or she's going behind the TV, or one time she tried to get up onto the sink and almost hung herself with the hair dryer cord. So she is quite a dog. But one of the things that we have had to do with Lucy is we've had to guide her or train her. Okay? So we've had to, from a very early age, we crate trained her, right? Because we didn't want her to go to the bathroom in the house. We wanted her to learn to go to the bathroom outside. We've also had to train her when people come over, because she's a little dog, so she loves to yap at people and bark at them, but we've had to train her how to respond to people. So we've had to guide her and train her in right behavior. Well, we are called as parents to do that, to have that same role with our kids. We're called to guide them, to train them in righteousness, in right behavior. Discipline is a good thing, okay? The word disciple comes from discipline. Leslie talked a little bit about discipline earlier, so I'm not going to repeat things she already said, but discipline is a good thing. Proverbs 13:24 says, "Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him diligently disciplines him." I love that idea, that if we love our kids, right? It's kind of the opposite of what society is saying now. If you love your kids, then you will discipline them, right? That's a part of loving them. And By the way, the term rod, right, refers back to a shepherd with his sheep. Okay, it's not referring to abusive actions. It's referring to how a shepherd would guide his sheep with the rod gently. A good shepherd's not going to beat his sheep. Right? It's not going to hurt his sheep. And we're also to have that role with our kids. Proverbs 12:1 says, "Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is stupid." Again, just this idea of how important discipline is to our life. If we love knowledge, which comes from discipline, then we're wise. How about instruction? Biblical definition of instruction means to inform the understanding in that of which it was before ignorant. Okay? So our children come into the world really as blank slates in many ways, in terms of understanding the world. And so they're ignorant on a lot of different things, right? They're ignorant from the very beginning of how to go to the restroom, how to feed themselves, how to put themselves to sleep. And so from the very beginning, we have that role as a parent to help our kids develop understanding about life, to develop knowledge. Okay, so we are not to provoke our children to anger, but we are to train them, discipline them, and guide them in righteousness and in truth. Okay, so how do we do that? Boundaries is a word that is very common in our vernacular today. Hasn't always been. I remember a time when if somebody said, "Are you setting boundaries?" they would think it has something to do with your house, like your fence or construction. But we now boundaries is everyone. Just about everyone uses the term boundaries in terms of talking about relationships. And so again, like I said, the word discipline or discipling, the other way around, discipling comes from the word discipline. And so we need boundaries in discipline. Dr. Salvador Minuchin was a psychologist. He passed away in 2017. He worked in Philadelphia with the Child Guidance Center. Incredible guy that did a lot of really good work with kids in the inner city, kids who grew up in single parent homes. But he developed structural theory of family systems. And so a lot of these ideas come from his ideas on working with families, helping families develop and be mature. Dr. Minuchin says that boundaries are rules for managing intimacy and defining the regulation of closeness, distance, hierarchy, and rules. Okay, so managing intimacy and defining the regulation of closeness, distance, hierarchy, and rules. Okay? Structural theory identifies three basic types of boundaries. Okay, I was here for Leslie's talk earlier, and she was using Bahrain's model on parenting styles, which I think goes really well with this model. It's kind of like a diamond, right? Has different sides to it, but they all represent, when you're looking at one side, you can describe it this way. If you look at it from a different side, you might describe it a different way, but they're all describing the same diamond. Okay, and so I think this model goes really well with what Leslie presented earlier about the different parenting styles. But Minuchin talks about three basic types of boundaries. The first one is clear boundaries. Clear boundaries allows for close connection while allowing each person to maintain a sense of autonomy. Okay, so parents with their children, families can try to have clear boundaries in the home that encourage connection with each other, but also reinforce the idea of autonomy. Okay, and we'll get into more in a minute about what that looks like. But you have connection on one side, you have autonomy on the other. And autonomy, I think, sometimes can get a negative rap in our culture, because when someone says, well, I'm really just protecting my autonomy, we hear that and we think, oh, well, you're just being selfish. Not necessarily. Autonomy or free will is a very important concept through the whole Bible. Going back from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible, right? In Genesis, right, what did God do with Adam and Eve? He put them in a garden, and what did he do? He gave them dominion, and he presented two different options about paths they could go down, which means he gave them a choice. They had a choice to make. In Revelation 3:20, Jesus says, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, then I will come in and dine with him. Okay, so in that we see Jesus knocking, right? We see him wanting to have connection with us. Oh, maybe I should use this. But we also see Jesus giving a choice in the matter of whether we're going to open up that door and invite him in. So God I've heard it say that God is a perfect gentleman, that he respects the boundaries of people. And so I think that's an important model. If God is someone who values free will, then I think we should value free will also. Okay, and so clear boundaries, you have connection, there's connection between the parent and the child, but there's also autonomy. Diffuse boundaries, that's the second type, allows for close connection, but each person doesn't maintain a sense of autonomy or individuality. Okay? So there's really no autonomy within the family system. There's connection, everyone's connected, but by and large, everyone believes the same thing or does the same thing. And diffuse boundaries leads to relational enmeshment. Okay, so families with diffuse boundaries don't make a distinction between members. Okay, let me give you an analogy. Let me give you an illustration. I'm always careful of using stories of clients. I change the story to protect confidentiality. But I have a client who grew up in a home where at a young age, his mother started sharing very personal information with him about his father. Information that was inappropriate for a 12-year-old child to hear about his father. A 12-year-old does not have the maturity to comprehend the type of things that were shared with this person. Later on, the parents got a divorce, and oldest brother moved out because he recognized that mom didn't have good boundaries. My client was a very caring person, very compassionate, so he cared about his mom, he was concerned, and she just kept on sharing these things with him. It got so bad for my client, by the time he was 18, he was in the role of surrogate husband with his mom in terms of what he was doing and the things that were being asked of him. Okay, that is enmeshment. That is an illustration of what enmeshment looks like. And he did not have autonomy in that family. He did not really have the freedom to really choose. I mean, he did have the freedom, but when you're indoctrinated in a system from a very young age where you're taught these things, he had a hard time really seeing, what were the clear roles he could take, what were the clear directions he could go in. Okay, so the second type of boundary is diffuse boundaries, and that leads to relational enmeshment in a home where there's very little autonomy. The third is rigid boundaries, okay? And rigid boundaries maintain a sense of autonomy, but don't allow for close connection. Okay, so there's a big emphasis on people's rights, protecting property, protecting freedoms, but it does not encourage connection in a home. And this leads to relational disengagement. Okay, so the three types of boundaries that govern homes are clear boundaries, diffuse boundaries, and rigid boundaries. Any questions about that slide or boundaries? Okay. So a really good question is, if we're thinking about having healthy boundaries in our home, what is the balance of autonomy and connection that we should try to have with our kids? Well, it changes throughout their lifespan. It changes throughout the development from the early years, infancy, all the way up to when they become an adult. So looking at an infant, in terms of autonomy and connection, what type of things can an infant do for themselves? Just about nothing. Yeah. Just about nothing. I mean, what can an infant do for themselves? They can communicate stress by crying? Yeah, sure. What else can they do? They can breathe. That's just about it, right? So when you think about that infancy period, there's high connection, right? I mean, if you're the parent, you're changing their diaper, you're feeding them, you're protecting them, you're putting them to sleep at night. So there's definitely a high connection there. Okay, but then how about moving to a 5-year-old? What kind of autonomy can a 5-year-old have? Trust themselves? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, most 5-year-olds can pick out their own clothes and dress themselves. So what else can they do? Most 5-year-olds are potty trained by that time, right? Yeah, they learn to go to the restroom by themselves. Sometimes they need a little bit of help. Yeah, They can feed themselves. Yeah, right. But they still need connection, don't they? There's a high connection needs, right? They can't protect themselves. They often don't make good decisions about things like crossing the street. You got to keep your eyes on them, right? So there's still high connection needs, and there's a little bit more autonomy there. Well, let's jump ahead to a 16-year-old. Okay, now we're talking about, drastically different cognitive ability. What can a 16-year-old do for themselves? They can drive. Yeah, we give 16-year-olds driver's license. They can go out and get a job. What else? They can cook. Some can. Some actually can learn to cook. My kids can't, but some can. It's crazy. My kids, it's like they go and live on their own, but then when they come home, it's like they forget to do the basic things, the basic sort of instinctual things. They don't know how to cook for themselves. They don't know how to do dishes. It's crazy. Yeah, 16-year-olds can, a lot of 16-year-olds can be social, right? They can build relationships or make decisions about friendships. So again, this, by the way, this is a generalization. I do want to highlight that. I mean, we can talk about kids with neurodivergency and other types of issues. So this is definitely a generalization. But it serves the point of trying to illustrate that throughout the lifetime of a child, in terms of our role as parents, kids have different types of autonomy and connection needs. Okay? How about an 18-year-old? Okay, an 18-year-old can do a lot of the same things that a 16-year-old can do. What else can they do? Date. My kids cannot date yet, but, they can get married, yeah. I'm not sure what the legal age in Oregon is to get married, but they are adults at 18. What else can they do? They can join the military. Mm-hmm. They can move out. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so again, there's a shift there. And if you notice on the graph that the connection need comes down a little bit, doesn't it? In terms of what the child needs at that point. They still need connection from mom and dad, but it comes down a little bit. They're in that time of individuation, where they're becoming an adult, they're making decisions for themselves. And so at that point, parents need to kind of take a step back and allow children to start to make decisions for themselves when it comes to autonomy. And oftentimes, that's why there's so much fighting in the home during that time, right? Because kids who are becoming adults are really trying to find their autonomy. They're trying to become individuals. And that's often hard for us as parents to see that. But it brings us to the goal of biblical parenting. Okay? You know, our children, when they're little, they're like that little caterpillar there. They're very vulnerable. Okay, but the goal of biblical parenting is not cocooning. That's not the goal, right? The goal is not that our kids would end up being in a cocoon. The goal is that our kids would become that beautiful butterfly, that they would learn to spread their wings and fly on their own, that they would become responsible, independent, God-loving, people-loving adults. That's the goal. Okay, but if we're not careful, if we don't have clear boundaries with our kids, then we can create enmeshment with them. Okay, and that's where they lack the autonomy to make decisions for themselves. Or we, on the other extreme, we could create rigid boundaries where we have kids who don't know how to connect with others. Okay? The other really important aspect to parenting our kids, to not provoking them to anger, is understanding subsystems in families. So every family is made up of subsystems. There are 3 different subsystems within a family. There's the marital subsystem. Okay, that's made up of the husband and wife, the couple where the family started. There's the parental subsystem. Okay, so that's mom and dad, but also now includes the kids. That's a subsystem. And then there's the sibling subsystem. And it's really important within a family that there's healthy boundaries between the subsystems. So when there's clear boundaries between the subsystems, a family is healthy. Okay? So what happens is oftentimes those boundaries between the subsystems become a little bit murky. Okay? All of a sudden, little Johnny becomes 13 years old, and little Johnny thinks he's an adult now. Okay, little Johnny wants to join the parenting subsystem. Okay, that's a problem. But sometimes it's the reverse. Sometimes you have a mom and dad, for whatever reason, start acting like a child. And for whatever reason, they start joining the child subsystem. Okay? So it's really important that there's clear boundaries there. It's really important that kids understand that mom and dad are mom and dad. Okay? That mom and dad, they are in their own subsystem, that they are a team, that they're going to make decisions together. They're going to make decisions about what kids are allowed to do and what they're not allowed to do. They're going to make decisions about what the family does or what the family doesn't do. Okay, so it's very important that there's separation there. One of the most unhealthy, damaging problems is something called cross-generational coalitions. A cross-generational coalition is when a subsystem forms between a parent and a child against the other parent. Other theorists call this triangulation. Okay, so for whatever reason, mom and dad have a conflict, and they're not able to work out that conflict, and so mom or dad ends up sharing with the child what's going on between them. And so what they do is they draw the child into that subsystem, right? And so the boundary is now gone. And that's damaging for kids. And oftentimes that coalition is covert. It's not something that's out in the open. But when a child is brought into that sort of relationship with their parent, it really starts to affect their autonomy as they're developing. Okay, any questions so far? We really got to watch out for those cross-generational coalitions. Okay? One of the things when I'm working with couples and I'm hearing about what's going on, one of the first pieces of advice that I give to a couple is make sure that when you're fighting, try to do that in a different room. Try not to do that in front of the kids. Help the kids to see that this is a mommy and daddy issue. That mommy and daddy need to work on this together in a constructive way. And it doesn't include Johnny or Sarah. Okay? Now, sometimes the conflicts do. And sometimes you need to include the kids in that. But the best thing that you can do as a couple in terms of the subsystems is that when you have a conflict, try to do that out of the ear range of the kids. Okay? And that will help with keeping boundaries between those subsystems. The next thing is subsystem hierarchy. And this might sound a little bit familiar. in terms of like what Leslie was talking about with the parenting styles. Hierarchy is, again, one of those terms in our society that's kind of become negative. It's kind of grouped with the word authority. Authority, bumper stickers that say what? Challenge authority, push back on authority. But authority is something that's created by God. It's throughout the Bible. If you look at Romans 13 is a really excellent passage on government authority. And what is the purpose of authority? Well, according to Romans 13, the purpose of authority is to protect the welfare of citizens and to punish evil. Right? It's a shepherding component. It's something that God created. And so it's not an unhealthy thing. It's a beautiful thing when it's done right. Now, we live in a fallen world, right? And we see abuses of authority all over the place. And we see abuses of authority in the home, too. Okay? But we need to understand that hierarchy is not... It's not inherently a negative thing. It's something that God created for the protection of the family. Okay, so what is a hierarchy? It's a system in which people are positioned above each other according to authority. Okay, so to have growing children, the parental subsystem must have an effective hierarchy. Okay, where there is an order, there are people in authority in the home who are making decisions for others, for the welfare of the family, for the protection of the family, for the guidance of the family. And so when it comes to parents and their relationship with kids, what we're shooting for is an effective hierarchy. And so an effective hierarchy is parents can set boundaries for their kids while still maintaining an emotional connection with their children. Okay? So I've done a lot of research on emotions in terms of the brain and the nervous system. And primarily my understanding of the emotional part of our brain that God has given us, the purpose of that is safety. It's to keep us safe in a world that has a lot of different threats. So when a child has emotional connection with their parents, they feel safe with their parents. So an effective hierarchy can set boundaries, can set rules for their kids while still maintaining that emotional connection. Okay, that they can create a place where their kids feel safe. And I'll get into in a minute when we get into specifics kind of what that looks like. But that's that grace and truth parenting, right? It's that balance there between setting good rules for our kids, for their protection, the truth aspect, of right and wrong. But also, on the other side, giving grace to our kids. Recognizing that they're going to make mistakes. They're going to blow it, right? We need grace. Each one of us needs grace. And so we need to give grace to our kids. An insufficient hierarchy is when the parents are not able to manage a child's behavior, and so they adopt a permissive parenting style. This is kind of goes with Leslie's teaching on the neglectful parent. So for whatever reason, parents are having a hard time with guiding their children, with instructing their children, with setting good boundaries. And so what they do is they just become permissive. It's kind of like a home where everything goes. Anybody grow up in a home like that? Just curious, okay? Right. And so an insufficient hierarchy between the parents and the child is low on truth. Okay, it's very high on grace. Everything goes, right? You know, it's kind of like the motto of Eugene a little bit, right? Everything goes. But it's low on truth. It's low on setting those appropriate boundaries for kids or those appropriate rules and enforcing them. So it's an insufficient hierarchy. The other hierarchy that I think creates problems is an excessive hierarchy. And so this is when the rules are too strict and unrealistic, and consequences are too severe to be effective. Okay, so Leslie talked about the authoritarian parenting style, right? And so it's kind of similar to that, where parents who are overly legalistic have unrealistic expectations for their kids. You guys gave some really good examples of that, right? Like always keep your room clean. Always get straight A's. My kids always do their chores. My kids never get in trouble at Sunday school at church, right? They're that unrealistic expectations of our kids. But not only that, consequences are too severe to be effective. I won't go into that because Leslie did a good job of talking about that, of when the consequence doesn't match the transgression. So the excessive hierarchy is the style that's low on grace, right? It's high on truth, it's high on rules in the home, but it's low on grace. Okay, when you blow it, there's not a lot of forgiveness in that home. There's not a lot of making forbearance for each other. And so I don't know about you, but in either of those hierarchies, other than the effective hierarchy, my perspective is that's a hard place for a kid to grow up in. Okay, either the permissive home where everything goes, or the excessive hierarchy where there's too many rules. There's legalism, okay? Dr. Dan Allender was a professor of mine, and he said that a child's healthy maturation will be determined by two questions. Did they feel loved in their home, and did they always get what they wanted? Okay, think about that for a second. Did they feel loved, and did they always get what they wanted? Okay, so healthy maturation, it really focuses on those two questions there. Again, we're aiming for a home where a child feels loved, right? Okay, they're not always going to feel loved, but we want a home where they feel loved, but we definitely don't want a home where they always get what they want. Okay, that's a home that lacks boundaries. Okay, how to have an effective hierarchy. Marion, you're looking at me. We did start late, just so you know that. Okay. I'm protecting my 45 minutes here. We started late. I'm going to kind of go through these a little bit fast. Some of these are things that have been talked about already. Number one, have a clear, spelled out expectations for your children. So clear, spelled out expectations rules. Don't let the expectations be muddy or murky. Be clear with your kids about the rules. Have appropriate rewards and consequences for the expectations. I already talked about that. Teach your children to take responsibility for their actions. That's huge. Watch out for the blaming and placating postures, right? Where your kids, they deflect taking responsibility because they're blaming others or blaming you for it. Or they're placating, which is the opposite. They're taking responsibility for something that they didn't do. Okay? Have regular scheduled outings with your kids that don't include lectures. That's so important, right? Let your kids see that you desire to have that relationship with them, and that it's not just about the rules. You actually really do care about them and want to hang out with them and get to know them. Understand kids often make mistakes, often choose to forgive. Okay? Forgiveness is so important in having an effective hierarchy. Recognize that relational patterns are caught more than they're taught. That's huge. Okay? So it's not just what we're saying to our kids, it's how we're modeling it to them through our actions. So exemplify boundaries by having a regular pattern of apologizing. I mean, one of the best gifts that you could give your kids is humility. Be a parent who is willing to admit when you make a mistake and apologize. That was one of the best gifts that my father gave me and my siblings. My dad made a lot of mistakes, but my dad was a really good apologizer when he made a mistake. Henry Nouwen says, the best thing that you can do to help your children grow is to be a growing person yourself. Continue to grow. Okay, lastly, how to provoke your children to anger. Okay, if you really want to provoke your children to anger, this is how you do it. Okay, I mean, write this down if this is what you're wanting. Have a parenting approach that is a do as I say, not as I do parenting. Okay? Leslie talked about hypocrisy. Being a parent says, hey, I want you to do this. I want you to do that. These are things that are important, but then don't actually live it out yourself. Don't actually model. Comparison parenting. Oh, Johnny, I wish you could really be like Sam next door. Oh, Sam is such a good kid. Sarah, oh, you're doing so good. Why can't you be like your sister Stacy? I mean, look at the grades she gets. Okay, comparison parenting. You want to provoke your children to anger? Start using that with them, comparing them to others. Okay, it doesn't respect their autonomy. Double bind parenting. Anybody know what that is? Double bind parenting is communicating two different messages to your kid at the same time. Oh, Johnny, I trust you. Okay, this often happens when kids become teenagers. Johnny, I trust you to make good decisions for yourself. Good decisions about your friends and about what you want to do in the future. But at the same time, the parent is making all the decisions for the kid. Okay, so they're communicating two different messages to the kids. As a matter of fact, research shows, this is not 100% proven through research, but that type of parenting, it can be a factor in the development of psychosis for kids, the double bind parenting. I already talked about the cross-generational coalition parenting. That's a no-no. Do everything you can to have a clear boundaries between mom and dad and the kids, right? Mom and dad are mom and dad, kids are kids, and keep a clear boundary there. So nurturing children with grace and truth requires resilience. As I start off with, being a parent is challenging in this world. I really feel for my kids when they have kids. It is a hard world to raise kids, and we need God's grace, right? But God says His grace is available for us. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. All right, that's it.